As America's 30th president, 1923 to 1929, Calvin Coolidge demonstrated his determination to preserve the old moral and economic precepts of frugality amid the material prosperity which many Americans were enjoying during the 1920s era. At 2:30 on the morning of August 3, 1923, while visiting in Vermont, Calvin Coolidge received word that he was president. By the light of a kerosene lamp, his father, who was a notary public, administered the oath of office as Coolidge placed his hand on the family Bible. Coolidge was distinguished for character more than for heroic achievement, wrote a Democratic admirer, Alfred E. Smith. His great task was to restore the dignity and prestige of the presidency when it had reached the lowest ebb in our history in a time of extravagance and waste. Born in Plymouth, Vermont, on July 4, 1872, Coolidge was the son of a village storekeeper. He was graduated from Amherst College with honors, and entered law and politics in Northampton, Massachusetts. Slowly, methodically, he went up the political ladder from councilman in Northampton to governor of Massachusetts, as a Republican. En route he became thoroughly conservative. As president, Coolidge demonstrated his determination to preserve the old moral and economic precepts amid the material prosperity which many Americans were enjoying. He refused to use federal economic power to check the growing boom or to ameliorate the depressed condition of agriculture and certain industries. His first message to Congress in December 1923 called for isolation in foreign policy, and for tax cuts, economy, and limited aid to farmers. He rapidly became popular. In 1924, as the beneficiary of what was becoming known as Coolidge prosperity, he polled more than 54% of the popular vote. In his inaugural he asserted that the country had achieved a state of contentment seldom before seen, and pledged himself to maintain the status quo. In subsequent years he twice vetoed farm relief bills, and killed a plan to produce cheap federal electric power on the Tennessee River. The political genius of President Coolidge, Walter Lippmann pointed out in 1926, was his talent for effectively doing nothing. This active inactivity suits the mood and certain of the needs of the country admirably. It suits all the business interests which want to be let alone. And it suits all those who have become convinced that government in this country has become dangerously complicated and top-heavy. Coolidge was both the most negative and remote of presidents, and the most accessible. He once explained to Bernard Baruch why he often sat silently through interviews. "Well, Baruch, many times I say only yes or no to people. Even that is too much. It winds them up for 20 minutes more." But no president was kinder in permitting himself to be photographed in Indian war bonnets or cowboy dress, and in greeting a variety of delegations to the White House. Both his dry Yankee wit and his frugality with words became legendary. His wife, Grace Goodhue Coolidge, recounted that a young woman sitting next to Coolidge at a dinner party confided to him she had bet she could get at least 3 words of conversation from him. Without looking at her he quietly retorted, "You lose." And in 1928, while vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota, he issued the most famous of his laconic statements, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. By the time the disaster of the Great Depression hit the country, Coolidge was in retirement. Before his death in January 1933, he confided to an old friend, "I feel I no longer fit in with these times." Calvin Coolidge was an American attorney and politician who served as the 30th President of the United States from 1923 to 1929. Born in Vermont, Coolidge was a Republican lawyer who climbed the ladder of Massachusetts politics, becoming the state's 48th governor. His response to the Boston police strike of 1919 thrust him into the national spotlight as a man of decisive action. The next year, Coolidge was elected the country's 29th vice president and succeeded to the presidency upon President Warren G. Harding's sudden death in 1923. Elected in his own right in 1924, Coolidge gained a reputation as a small government conservative with a taciturn personality and dry sense of humor that earned him the nickname Silent Cal. His widespread popularity enabled him to run for a second full term, but Coolidge chose not to run again in 1928, remarking that 10 years as president would be longer than any other man has had it too long. During his gubernatorial career, Coolidge ran on the record of fiscal conservatism, strong support for women's suffrage, and vague opposition to prohibition. During his presidency, he restored public confidence in the White House after the many scandals of the Harding administration. He signed into law the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans, and oversaw a period of rapid and expansive economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties, leaving office with considerable popularity. He was known for his hands-off governing approach and pro-business stances. Biographer Claude Fewis wrote, "He embodied the spirit and hopes of the middle class, could interpret their longings and express their opinions. That he did represent the genius of the average is the most convincing proof of his strength." Scholars have ranked Coolidge in the lower half of U.S. presidents. He gains nearly universal praise for his stalwart support of racial equality during a period of heightened racial tension in the nation, and is highly praised by advocates of smaller government and laissez-faire economics. Supporters of an active central government generally view him far less favorably. His critics argue that he failed to use the country's economic boom to help struggling farmers and workers in other flailing industries, and there is still much debate among historians as to the extent to which Coolidge's economic policies contributed to the onset of the Great Depression. On August 2, 1923, President Harding died unexpectedly from a heart attack in San Francisco while on a speaking tour of the western United States. Vice President Coolidge was in Vermont visiting his family home, which had neither electricity nor a telephone, when he received word by messenger of Harding's death. Coolidge dressed, said a prayer, and came downstairs to greet the reporters who had assembled. His father, a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the oath of office in the family's parlor by the light of a kerosene lamp at 2:47 a.m. on August 3, 1923, whereupon the new President of the United States returned to bed. Coolidge returned to Washington the next day, and was sworn in again by Justice Adolph A. Holing Jr. of the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia, to forestall any questions about the authority of a state official to administer a federal oath. This second oath-taking remained a secret until it was revealed by Harry M. Doherty in 1932, and confirmed by Holing. When Holing confirmed Doherty's story, he indicated that Doherty, then serving as United States Attorney General, asked him to administer the oath without fanfare at the Willard Hotel. According to Holing, he did not question Doherty's reason for requesting a second oath-taking but assumed it was to resolve any doubt about whether the first swearing-in was valid. Bureau, June 1924. The nation initially did not know what to make of Coolidge, who had maintained a low profile in the Harding administration. Many had even expected him to be replaced on the ballot in 1924. Coolidge believed that those of Harding's men under suspicion were entitled to every presumption of innocence, taking a methodical approach to the scandals, principally the Teapot Dome scandal, while others clamored for rapid punishment of those they presumed guilty. Coolidge thought the Senate investigations of the scandals would suffice. This was affirmed by the resulting resignations of those involved. He personally intervened in demanding the resignation of Attorney General Harry M. Doherty after he refused to cooperate with the congressional probe. He then set about to confirm that no loose ends remained in the administration, arranging for a full briefing on the wrongdoing. Harry A. Slattery reviewed the facts with him, Harlan F. Stone analyzed the legal aspects for him, and Senator William E. Borah assessed and presented the political factors. Coolidge addressed Congress when it reconvened on December 6, 1923, giving a speech that supported many of Harding's policies, including Harding's formal budgeting process, the enforcement of immigration restrictions and arbitration of coal strikes ongoing in Pennsylvania. The address to Congress was the first presidential speech to be broadcast over the radio. The Washington Naval Treaty was proclaimed just 1 month into Coolidge's term, and was generally well received in the country. In May 1924, the World War I Veterans World War Adjusted Compensation Act or Bonus Bill was passed over his veto. Coolidge signed the Immigration Act later that year, which was aimed at restricting Southern and Eastern European immigration, but appended a signing statement expressing his unhappiness with the bill's specific exclusion of Japanese immigrants. Just before the Republican convention began, Coolidge signed into law the Revenue Act of 1924, which reduced the top marginal tax rate from 58% to 46%, as well as personal income tax rates across the board, increased the estate tax and bolstered it with a new gift tax. On June 2, 1924, Coolidge signed the act granting citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. By that time, 2/3 of them were already citizens, having gained it through marriage, military service. Veterans of World War I were granted citizenship in 1919, or the land allotments that had earlier taken place. After his presidency, Coolidge retired to a spacious home in Northampton, the Beaches. He kept a Hacker runabout boat on the Connecticut River and was often observed on the water by local boating enthusiasts. During this period, he also served as chairman of the Nonpartisan Railroad Commission, an entity created by several banks and corporations to survey the country's long-term transportation needs and make recommendations for improvements. He was an honorary president of the American Foundation for the Blind, a director of New York Life Insurance Company, president of the American Antiquarian Society, and a trustee of Amherst College. Coolidge published his autobiography in 1929 and wrote a syndicated newspaper column, Calvin Coolidge Says, from 1930 to 1931. Faced with a Democratic landslide in the 1932 presidential election, some Republicans spoke of rejecting Hoover as their party's nominee, and instead drafting Coolidge to run. Coolidge made it clear that he was not interested in running again, and that he would publicly repudiate any effort to draft him. Hoover was renominated, and Coolidge made several radio addresses in support of him. Hoover then lost the general election to Coolidge's 1920 vice presidential Democratic opponent Franklin D. Roosevelt in a landslide. Coolidge died suddenly from coronary thrombosis at the Beaches on January 5, 1933, at 12:45 p.m., aged 60. Shortly before his death, he confided to an old friend, "I feel I no longer fit in with these times." Coolidge is buried in Plymouth Notch Cemetery, Plymouth Notch, Vermont. The nearby family home is maintained as one of the original buildings on the Calvin Coolidge Homestead District site. The state of Vermont dedicated a new visitors center nearby to mark Coolidge's 100th birthday on July 4, 1972. Despite his reputation as a quiet and even reclusive politician, Coolidge made use of the new medium of radio and made radio history several times while president. He made himself available to reporters, giving 520 press conferences, meeting with reporters more regularly than any president before or since. Coolidge's second inauguration was the first presidential inauguration broadcast on radio. On December 6, 1923, his speech to Congress was broadcast on radio, the first presidential radio address. Coolidge signed the Radio Act of 1927, which assigned regulation of radio to the newly created Federal Radio Commission. On August 11, 1924, Theodore W. Case, using the phonofilm sound-on-film process he developed for Lee DeForest, filmed Coolidge on the White House lawn, making Silent Cal the first president to appear in a sound film. The title of the DeForest film was President Coolidge, taken on the White House grounds. When Charles Lindbergh arrived in Washington on a U.S. Navy ship after his celebrated 1927 transatlantic flight, President Coolidge welcomed him back to the U.S. and presented him with the Medal of Honor. The event was captured on film. Thank you for watching this video.